Good evening, I'm Don Arleth, and you're watching World News Tonight, coming to you live from Warsaw. A victory for Viktor Orbán in the White House. U.S. President Donald Trump granted Hungary an exemption from sanctions on Russian oil and gas. But it's not forever. We'll tell you just how long in just a moment, but first, the latest headlines. EU tightens visa rules for Russians amid security concerns. Poland's ex-justice minister stripped of immunity and charged with 26 offenses. And with a series of experiments and a planned satellite launch, the Polish space industry is thriving. With U.S. sanctions on Russian oil looming, this was a do-or-die meeting for Prime Minister Viktor Orbán at the White House on Friday. Hungary has long faced criticism from the EU and NATO for relying too heavily on Russian energy, despite the ongoing war in Ukraine. But in the end, Orbán was able to secure a one-year exemption from Donald Trump to continue business as usual with Vladimir Putin. Sonia Gatabishchan reports.
Against all odds,
he has asked for an exemption. We haven't granted one, but he has asked Viktor.
Orbán, the Hungarian Prime Minister, did secure a one-year exemption on Donald Trump's sanctions connected to using Russian energy in a Friday meeting with the U.S. President.
We have concluded that Hungary is in a significantly different situation from other European countries. And it is not possible to secure Hungary's energy supply and to provide affordable energy to Hungarian families and businesses if sanctions continue to be imposed on two key pipelines.
The White House justified the exemption by saying that Hungary is a landlocked country unable to import alternative oil and gas. But according to experts from the Center for the Study of Democracy, this is simply not true.
Hungary is connected to the Adria pipeline starting from the Croatian Adriatic coast, which can deliver 400,000 oil barrels per day to Central Europe, 30% more than the total oil demand of the region. Croatia has reiterated on a number of occasions that it is willing and ready to replace the Russian oil in 24 hours. Hungary has simply refused.
Throughout the years, Hungary has consistently relied on Russian energy and shown no real intention of phasing it out after Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In fact, since then until the end of 2024, Hungary has imported 13.5 million tons of Russian crude oil, worth 6.3 billion euros.
I think it is clearly a high risk for Hungary. Instead of getting into the network of the EU, we still hang on to our dependency towards Russia, and I think it's really not good news for the citizens.
Furthering an anti-Ukrainian policy, Orbán has been seen as a lone wolf in the EU even prior to requesting the exemption.
Orbán has been avoided lately. They made statements, 26 member states without Orbán interfering, or they basically disregarded his opinion. So this tendency will just continue, and definitely it won't make any better. It won't make our relationship with the EU any better. What we see all over the place in Budapest, these billboards against the Commission President and this anti-EU campaign will probably continue, and now he can show it as a victory.
The development comes ahead of the Hungarian parliamentary elections expected in April 2026, with recent polls showing Orbán's Fidesz party trailing behind its rival TISA party, begging the question, with the exemption, has Trump now handed Orbán a critical boost ahead of the big race? For TVP World, I'm Sonia Gatabishchan.
And for the first reactions from Ukraine concerning Hungary being granted a one-year exemption from U.S. sanctions on Russian oil and gas and overnight attacks on Ukraine's energy grid, we now go live to our correspondent Oz Chatterjee, who's in Kyiv. Good evening, Oz. So not only is Hungary blocking Ukraine's accession to the EU, but it also received a one-year sanctions exemption on the supply of Russian oil and gas. So what's the reaction from Kyiv?
Oh, look, it's interesting that this comes on the day that Russia launched one of its largest ever attacks against Ukraine's energy sector, with the Ukrainian state-owned energy company Centrenergo reporting that all of its working thermal power plants were down after all of them were targeted in this overnight Russian attack. Now, there's been no official line from Kyiv directly responding to this news coming out of Washington with Viktor Orbán and President Trump. However, there was a subtle remark at the end of one of President Zelensky's addresses about the kinds of measures that Kyiv wants to see to try to bring this war to an end. Let's take a listen to Zelensky's statement there.
Restoration works continue after the overnight attack. It was a massive attack involving a large number of ballistic missiles. At least 25 were used, as well as aeroballistics, cruise missiles, and more than 450 drones of various types. It was a very brazen attack and in many ways demonstrative. There's not enough pressure on Russia, and any easing of the existing pressure points only encourages Putin to prolong this war, to cause greater harm to our country, to our people, and also to others in the world. Weak responses to Russia's arrogance motivate Moscow to continue the war. There must be enough sanctions and pressure to leave Russia without the means to sustain itself under wartime conditions.
So not a direct response there, but certainly a message being sent from Kyiv. And these attacks by Russia killed 3 people and injured 12 after a missile hit a building, residential building in Dnipro. So again, another difficult day for Ukrainian civilians, for Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and for the government here in Kyiv. With this news coming from Washington about this sanctions exemption for Hungary. Back to you, Don.
All right, Oz Chatterjee there. Do stay safe and try and keep yourself warm. Thanks for that report. In response to Russian hybrid attacks on Europe and Moscow's Phase 1 preparations for a conflict with NATO, it's increasingly questioned why the EU is so open to allowing Russian citizens to visit member states. That's about to change, though, as the bloc tightens the rules on Russian nationals traveling to the European Union. Anastasia Yanchenko explains in this report.
Beware, Russian passport holders! The European Commission has tightened the rules for issuing multiple entry Schengen visas.
This means Russian nationals will have to apply for a new visa each time they plan to travel to the EU.
The decision comes as Moscow, now in its 4th year of full-scale war in Ukraine, has been waging a broader campaign of sabotage and hybrid warfare aimed at destabilizing Europe and NATO. Poland remains one of Russia's primary targets, facing hybrid attacks across multiple sectors, including banking and critical infrastructure.
We have more than 1,000 incidents daily. It's more than 2 times more than 2 years ago. Those perpetrators and hackers are using more and more sophisticated tools.
The threat isn't limited to hybrid warfare. According to Poland's internal security agency, 55 people of different nationalities were detained in recent months for carrying out acts of sabotage ordered by Russia.
Russia often carries out acts of sabotage through proxies. In a recent case, a Colombian national arrived in Europe and traveled to Poland, where he set fire to 2 construction warehouses in Warsaw and Radom.
Furthermore, a growing number of Ukrainians have been detained in Poland for their ties to sabotage and terrorist groups. Recently, 3 individuals were imprisoned for their involvement in Russian-directed arson attack that destroyed a Warsaw shopping mall in 2024.
It's not a coincidence that in majority of cases of those disposable agents in Poland, Ukrainians were perpetrators. Russian aim was to blame Ukrainians, to raise a fear among Polish society that Ukraine is trying to drag Poland into a war.
The complexities do not end there. The Polish border guard reports that the number of Russians entering Poland has grown steadily, from 62,000 in 2022 to nearly 80,000 by September 2025, despite Poland's decision to restrict the movement of Russian citizens and close several border crossings.
Annual updates to the regulations have allowed more groups to enter Poland. Currently, entry is permitted for students, scientists, holders of permanent or temporary residence permits, Russians working in Poland or abroad, those married to EU citizens, and diplomats.
The latest controversy in Poland was sparked by a new bus route between Warsaw and Kaliningrad, one of Poland's 8 direct links with Russia. Most routes operate daily, and for Russian travelers, the connection remains both convenient and popular.
With entry restrictions in place, fewer people are crossing the border. I cross this border regularly and rarely encounter long lines.
Does it pose a threat to Poland? Experts and government officials are divided on the issue.
This channel may be used by Russia to infiltrate Polish territory with sabotagers or people with other intelligence tasks to commit on Polish soil.
The threat is Russia's aggression and Mr. Putin's regime. This threat stems from the actions of Russian intelligence services, not ordinary Russians.
But whether or not ordinary Russians are a threat, they now have to face a new reality and cope with a new level of European restrictions. For TVP World, Anastasia Yanchenko.
Hundreds of drones, ballistic missiles, and other types of airborne weapons fly towards Ukraine every day and night. Often, it's the grassroots private technology sector that responds and finds solutions to these threats. So what does modern air defense training look like? Let's find out in this report on combat simulators.
One of the top priorities and, at the same time, most difficult tasks for the armed forces of Ukraine is to protect the country's entire airspace. The grueling years of war have proven members of the air defense forces as experts in this field, thanks to hours of training and long-term combat experience. Here is how Ukraine's best defenders of the skies train in the 21st century.
We began our operations in 2018-2019. When full-scale war broke out, we retrained and constructed simulators for various types of small arms, as well as air defense simulators for eliminating Shaheds and other aerial targets that attack Ukraine every day. This way, we expanded our arsenal and now have over 50 types of combat simulators.
Training on military simulators brings a number of logistical and financial benefits.
First of all, it's a very safe way of target practice. Secondly, this training method is very cost and time effective. It allows us to save ammunition and travel time to the shooting range and all the logistics involved in simply allowing soldiers to shoot. Training here is basically free of charge. A Kalashnikov cartridge costs about $1, whereas here all it uses up is electricity.
But it's effectiveness during actual combat that's of utmost importance.
It is not the words but actions that speak the loudest here. The soldiers who train with us bring their trophies. Here lies a Gerbera, a Russian long-range unmanned aerial vehicle, and next to it are fragments of a KH-101 missile. The number of accurate hits has gone up significantly. The lads returned and want to train even more on the simulators because it really improves their effectiveness.
There are many training centres like this across Ukraine, and training for soldiers is free of charge. A growing number of European countries are purchasing this type of equipment and incorporating it into their militaries, strengthening the quality of their preparations for the increasingly frequent threats in the airspace.
Poland's former justice minister is facing arrest after he was stripped of his immunity on Friday. Zbigniew Ziobro of the previous Law and Justice government is suspected of committing 26 offenses during his time in office. He could face up to 25 years in prison. However, he is now reportedly outside the country. Kazimierz Wysiak reports.
again and again and again. Members of the Polish parliament had to vote 27 times on Friday on all motions from the state prosecution to bring the former Minister of Justice, Zbigniew Ziobro, to justice. The former official from the Conservative Law and Justice Party is accused of 26 different counts of embezzlement, as well as using Pegasus spyware against members of the then opposition. The last vote was on his temporary arrest.
The circumstances, meaning overwhelming evidence pointing to the guilt of the accused, create grounds for the prosecution to ask for temporary arrests, in conformity with the penal code.
Poland has never seen such a high-profile public figure facing such serious charges. Zbigniew Ziobro is accused of leading an organized crime ring responsible for misusing some 35 million euros of public money intended for victims of crimes. Instead, the minister allegedly ordered these funds to be handed to local services and businesses in exchange for favorable votes during the 2023 parliamentary election. If found guilty in court, he could face up to 25 years in prison. Ziobro's party is rejecting these allegations as political repression.
This just shows us the intellectual level and morality of the government. They're after those who fought against crime.
The state prosecutor now has to bring in the former minister to officially lay charges against him. The only problem is, he was last seen in Hungary. Zbigniew Ziobro claims he's there for health reasons, having gone through esophageal cancer. But a court medical expert has said this shouldn't be an issue at this stage.
The medical examiner specializing in oncology has declared former Minister Ziobro to be physically and mentally fit for participating in the legal proceedings.
Despite that, Minister Ziobro shows no intention of returning home. Instead, he's used his condition and the state of public healthcare as an argument against the government of Prime Minister Donald Tusk.
As the press reports today, surgeries and therapies are being postponed because public healthcare has no money for treatment. Tusk deliberately staged a circus of lawlessness by hunting me down in order to media silence the oncology crisis.
But Ziobro's stay in Hungary is also raising questions over his readiness to defend himself in court. His former deputy, Marcin Romanowski, asked for political asylum in Hungary last year after also being accused of embezzlement. The pro-Russian government of Viktor Orbán has refused to give him up to Poland.
Hungary is part of the European Union and it should abide by the EU law. The biggest issue for us is that a Polish MP is asking for help from Europe's closest ally of Vladimir Putin.
If the former minister does not come back to Poland soon, the prosecution will ask the court to issue an international arrest warrant after him. Hungary can refuse to give him up if it finds that the warrant infringes on human rights. For TVP World, I'm Kazimierz Łysiak.
To mark Independence Day next Tuesday on November 11th, Poland will launch its first military satellites into space. The country's space industry is growing rapidly, also thanks to Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski, who conducted multiple experiments during his stay on board the International Space Station. Sonia Gata-Biszczan brings us this report.
The first results are in for one of the 13 experiments conducted by Polish astronaut Sławomir Uznański-Wiśniewski on board the International Space Station. The initial phase of the Leopard ISS experiment, which involves an advanced computer equipped with AI algorithms and machine learning, has proven that Polish hardware and software can work in orbit.
Leopard processes data in orbit, which enables it to detect failures quicker, before they become a threat to the mission. Imagine an observational satellite that detects a fire or an oil spill while mapping Earth and immediately notifies the relevant services about it. This is the kind of progress that the Leopard ISS is bringing us closer to.
Instead of sending huge amounts of raw data to Earth, Leopard analyzes it directly on board the ISS, reducing reaction time to potential problems and enhancing autonomy of space missions. And success in conducting experiments like this in space not only leads to scientific advancements, but also economic benefits.
To sell something in the space sector, you need to have something called space heritage, which is the final stamp. Yes, this has properly worked in space conditions on the ISS, on a small satellite, or whatever.
The focal point of the experiment thus far has been autonomous navigation, critical for future space missions. In the absence of GPS signals on the Moon or Mars, robots must be able to determine their location independently. By virtue of having been in space, the technology has already benefited its developers.
As I heard from people working there, they already are selling this product because Sławosz has brought this experiment and had it tested on the International Space Station.
The Polish mission to the ISS advanced the country's space sector, which continues to grow. On Thursday, Polish Defense Minister Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz announced that Poland's first military satellites will be in orbit in a matter of days. Among them is a synthetic aperture radar satellite that captures detailed satellite imagery regardless of weather conditions, critical for security and defense.
We can see the movements, for example, of the army in satellite images, right? So we can see how the enemy is approaching, for example, our border.
Poland's military satellites will launch into space aboard a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral, Florida. For TVP World, I'm Sonia Agatabishchan.
Russia continues to pound Ukrainian energy infrastructure as winter approaches. The situation on the front lines remains dire, and NATO Secretary General warns of a forever war if Europe does not step up to help. Even Poland's Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski told TVP World this week that Kyiv is bracing for another 3 years of war. Now, to take stock of these recent developments, we're joined by the founder of Ukraine Freedom Project, Stephen Moore. Stephen, good evening. Great to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Likewise. Yeah, for sure.
All right, Stephen. Last time I saw you on this program, I asked you the same question I'm going to ask you right now, but the situation slightly changed a little bit since we've talked last. So Ukraine is at a 2 billion euro shortfall in natural gas. Centrenergo thermal plants have been knocked out of commission as winter is fast approaching. I'll pose the question again. Do you think this year is going to be different from the other years that we've seen in the winter? Do you think Ukraine is going to be able to adapt, as it always has done, to be able to keep people warm this winter?
Well, Don, we have electricity in my house today. And otherwise, I may not be able to be here with you. But, there are more blackouts. There's rolling blackouts that the energy company gives us warning about. So there's actually more of those this year than there used to be, because it used to be there wasn't that many, actually. And, the heroes of this war are the people that keep the electricity on, the people that keep the train tracks repaired when the Russians blow them up. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be a little bit rougher winter, but I think that the Ukrainian people are accustomed to rough winters. They're accustomed to this unkind treatment by the Russians. And, we actually did a poll that showed that 60% of Ukrainians agreed with the statement that the Ukrainian people can hold out longer than Russia's economy can continue to fuel this war. And 60% agree with that statement.
Yeah, let's hope that is the case. It looks like we're going to need a little bit of time for these Ukrainian-imposed sanctions on Russian oil to bite. But meanwhile, NATO Secretary General this week warns of a forever war if Europe doesn't do more. What should Europe do to make sure that this isn't the case? Should defense spending in Europe be prioritized for Ukraine first, for instance? Because if Ukraine fails, then Europe will be next.
Yeah, exactly. And Europe is this is a chronic disappointment. I think we've had this conversation many, many times. And, my least favorite country in Europe is Belgium. Belgium is buying enough liquid natural gas, 3 million euro worth of liquid natural gas from Russia every day, which is enough to buy 71 Shahed drones. And so they're paying for a lot of dead Ukrainian civilians. And of course, they've got somewhere near $200 billion in frozen Russian assets that all they've done is tax. So they've taken about $1 billion out of that frozen Russian assets, but they haven't sent much of it to Ukraine. And of course, they are the third most underfunded NATO country for the last since 2014. So, I don't know what they're doing there, but they're not helping Ukraine, and they have a lot of capacity to do so.
Well, hopefully that situation will change as well. Now, with the situation on the front line deteriorating and Ukrainian forces, it faces a huge manpower problems. Is it fathomable that Ukraine can fight for another 3 years, as Poland's foreign minister told us on TVP World this week?
Yeah, that is dependent on aid from Europe or aid from the United States. And, and listen, that can come in a lot of different forms. I was at this weekend at a hackathon, and, the level of technological advancement that's coming out of Ukraine is just breathtaking. American weapons, especially the drones, really don't work over here. They're very expensive, and they don't work as well as the homegrown Ukrainian drones, which are, $500 to $1,000 for a kamikaze drone. So, you can either have governments send money, or investors can come in and invest in this Ukrainian defense tech that the Europeans are using right now. They called the Ukrainians and said, hey, we've got some Russian drones coming in. Do you think you could send us some experts and some equipment about how to keep them out of our airports and out of our central cities? And so there's Ukrainians right now that are helping them do that.
Do you think that's why we saw the defense minister go for the joint expeditionary forces? We have Ukraine becoming involved with that alliance, if you will. Do you think that they're more in need of Ukraine than Ukraine necessarily is of them in terms of what they agreed upon this week?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you this, is that Ukraine has the most experienced and technologically advanced military in the world right now. So these people are hardened fighters. And one of my Ukrainian friends who's at the front actually went to Spain for training, for military training. And he said, yeah, they taught us how to fight in Afghanistan. And then they asked us a bunch of questions. So, this is what Americans and Europeans don't realize yet is we're in a global war. And, the only people acting on that information is our adversaries. So, Ukraine's expertise and hardware is going to be very important in the very near future.
Viktor Orbán paid a visit to the White House on Friday. He secured a 1-year exemption on U.S. sanctions on Russian oil. How do you think that's being looked at in Kyiv, especially in light of Orbán blocking Ukraine's path to the European Union?
Yeah, that's hard to understand. Orban, we're all aware that he's the best pal of Putin in Europe, but a lot of people don't know that he sent 85 million euro to Iran to help them with their nuclear program back in the day. He's trained their scientists. In like January of 2024, just a few months after October 7th, everyone else in the world, every other country in the world is trying to isolate Iran's economy, and Orban opens up a trade agreement with Iran. So, he is not a good partner for anybody. He's got to deal with the Chinese for security, so he's playing all sides of the fence. He's just a squirrely guy. And, how he gets in the White House is beyond me.
Well, now the EU has tightened the visa rules for Russian citizens. Now they'll have to be approved for every single visit. Do you think that this is long overdue? I'm sure you do. But will it help prevent some of these sabotage attacks that we've been seeing committed by Russian operatives?
Yeah, that's hard to say because, I don't know if the Russians themselves are committing those. And look, I think I agree with anything that makes life harder on Russians. But they hire people in Poland, criminals, and lowlifes to do these things. So it's not just the Russians actually committing the acts, but it's people that live in the countries where the sabotage is happening. So that's a hard one to beat, man. That's like they're good at that.
Yes, indeed they are. Indeed they are. Well, what effects there will be, we'll yet to see. I'd like to thank you, Stephen Moore, founder of the Ukraine Freedom Project. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
Always a good time, my friend. We'll see you soon.
All right. Thank you. And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thanks for joining us, and stay with us for more here on TVP World.